My next guest overcame a major life change in her 20s to become an accomplished author, a teacher, an award winner. Her memoir is called Long Time No See. It's available wherever books are sold. Her name is Beth Finke. Beth, how are you?
I'm great, thanks.
It's great to talk to you. I love your story. I think you have a very inspiring story. I think it's a story of resilience and overcoming adversity and kind of finding a light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing, you know?
Well,
And
good to hear. It
no,
doesn't
it
always
is.
feel that way, but
Well, I know, I'm
yes.
sure, but I'm the reason I'm doing this is because I think that there's people that can relate to every story that we tell on some level,
hmm
and your story I think is right up there with it, and so it's a good one that I really want to tell.
Great.
For you, it started when you were 7 years old.
All right.
You were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
Yes.
Then by the time you were in your 20s, you got married.
Yes.
You were on your honeymoon in Scotland,
Yes.
and you started seeing spots.
Right.
Tell me about that, about what happened. And I understand that it was tied into the diabetes somehow.
Yes. So yes, I was diagnosed when I was 7 years old, and I think that was 1966, and it was before they had blood glucose monitors or short-acting insulin. So we did our best, and but I did grow up knowing that it's possible that I could become blind. I could have a kidney disease. It could lead to amputations. So I knew all that. So when fast forward, I lived a great life. Loved high school, loved college, loved my husband, got married, and we're on our honeymoon, and we were up in Scotland. At the time, I was the assistant director for the study abroad office at University of Illinois. That's where I graduated from, and I'd studied overseas.
Hmm.
And I was working on a degree to continue doing some work in higher ed. Um, so that was my job, and that year it was my turn to bring all the students who were studying all over Britain, to bring them all to London together, where we spent a week in London and kind of learned how to change money and do all that kind of stuff. But then Mike joined me there. That's my husband's name, Mike. And we took off for Scotland. So we were driving around. He was driving, and there were sheep. Sheep started crossing the road, so we had to stop. And I looked at the sheep, and they had spots on them. And I thought, well, that's odd. I thought, well, maybe the sheep in Scotland have spots. But so I took my contacts out and cleaned them and put them back in, and I still had the spots. And so I knew that was. I didn't know. I hadn't researched, but I thought this is the blindness thing, or this
Right.
is first signs of that. So we got home. We lived in Urbana, Illinois, but we knew to see a specialist in Chicago. There's more opportunities for doctors up there.
Hmm.
So we found a specialist up there. I started having laser treatments about every week to try to get rid of the spots. And they'd work for a little while, and then the spots would come back. And eventually the spots got bigger. And when the spots, they started, it just, in one eye, I couldn't see at all. One day I'd wake up in the morning. Well, it was tough waking up, to be honest. You woke up and you wondered, how much am I going to see today?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then one morning I woke up and I couldn't see at all out of one eye. And I called the doctor, and they said, well, we can't do the lasers if we can't see inside your eye. So let's hope that just goes away.
Hmm.
It didn't. And then, some weeks later, I was actually, what was I doing? I was getting ready for work. Mike had already gone to work. And the other eye, it was like a window shade just kind of being pulled down really slowly. And I
Really?
thought, oh, this is going. So I took out my photo albums. I used to take a lot of photos and keep them really straight. And so I just started looking at them to kind of try to memorize what people looked like. And then we were off to the hospital and did some dire surgeries that work for 80% of the people that have them and restore their vision. But what I learned from all that is that the 20%, there's always somebody in the 20%. So I
Hmm.
was in the 20%.
So at the time that you lost your sight, as you mentioned, you were working for the University of Illinois, and
hmm
I understand that after you lost your sight, you lost your job.
Yes.
Now, I understand that was a different time than now, and
hmm
so can you tell me how and why you lost your job? Was it strictly because of your sight?
Yes. But it was tricky. How I learned, um, okay, well, I was ready to come back to work. I'd went to rehab, blind rehab, where you learn how to use a cane and how to read Braille and all that. That was the first thing I had to do. So I didn't come back to work for that. I had a break from work. And then when I was ready to come back, the office was moving to a different office. And my boss suggested that I wait until they move, because why should I learn this office? And that made sense to me. But while I had that time off, I thought, well, I'm going to take some more graduate courses. When you were a university employee, you could tuition free. You could study tuition free. And then one day I was at the class, and the professor asked me to come up afterwards and said, you need to go down to the administration office because there's some problem with your bill, and I shouldn't have had a bill. But anyway, I got myself somehow to the administration office. And when I got up to get my turn, the person behind the desk said, well, you need to pay your tuition. And I said, well, no, I was tuition free. I'm an employee of the university. And they said, oh, no, your contract has been terminated.
Wow.
That's how I found out.
Wow.
So I never talked to my boss about it. I never, we considered doing some kind of lawsuit or something, but I realized I didn't want to work there. I mean, if I won the case, I'd have my job back.
Right.
And so, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act had not been passed. It was passed 5 years later. So I think now with the ADA, it works. It doesn't work, whatever. It's not perfect. But I think I know for sure from stories I've heard, universities are very reluctant to dismiss somebody because of a disability. They know it's illegal. A university especially, I think would be, that unlikely to use that and be so brazen as to say that was why,
Absolutely. I mean, especially this day and age, something like that would go viral quick.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Public relations nightmare.
Right. I'm glad. I'm glad things have changed.
Oh, yeah. That's why when I first heard about that, and I understood that this was from years ago, I still couldn't believe it, even though this is from years ago that happened.
Well, and all of that, you don't need your sight for. It's all listening, talking, getting on the phone. So that was the big shame of it. I could see, if I was teaching, surgery or so, I don't know if there was something else I was doing.
Surgery for sure. But I understand. Under the circumstances, there was no grounds for it at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So now you found yourself trying to adjust to life, not just with this new disability, but now you find yourself trying to adjust to life without a job.
Right.
Tell me about that time, because I'm sure that must have taken a toll on you mentally.
Yes, it did. At the time, I was still learning. I hadn't learned how to use a talking computer yet. There were still things I had to learn to help me just be a blind person in a sighted world. So I was working on that, and I would get little victories anytime I did something, like I walked to the mailbox by myself and put a letter in the mailbox and came back. I would say, I learned to congratulate, and my husband was very helpful and worked with me, and we would celebrate the victories. Even though I was no longer a student or on the university faculty, I was able to go to the University of Illinois Rehab Center, where they had all these computers. That was a huge bonus. It's kind of difficult to learn how to do that, and it would be hard to learn on my own, but having this person there. So I did that too, and I started thinking about what could I do? What can I do now? Well, I did have my degree was in journalism, but by the time I was a senior in college, I decided I didn't want to pester people, so I didn't want to be a journalist. I was too dumb to understand, now I know, because I am a writer and I don't pester people if I don't have to. I was in the hospital for 3 months, 1 month for each surgery. I had 3 surgeries. So, and while I was in the hospital, I had to lay with my head down all the time. Like, I say it was in a hemorrhoid pillow, it was a donut pillow, and I had to have my face down like that. So I couldn't, a social worker had suggested I keep a journal while I was in the hospital, because that's what social workers suggest. But my eyes were patched up. I couldn't write, so every day I would talk into the tape recorder. So I brought those cassette tapes to the rehab center where I was practicing on the computers, and I listened to the tapes, and I would copy them. I type them into the computer, and when I was done and I put them all together, I thought, well, this might make a pretty good story.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Um, so I got involved, not involved, but I learned that there's a book, the Library of Congress has a talking book service where you can get books on tape for free. At the time, they mail them to you. So I listened to books written by other blind people, people who'd lost their sight or people born blind, to see if my story had already been told or should I bother telling it. And a lot of those books are by people who do great things like sail across the ocean and they're blind, or I can't remember his name now, but the guy that climbed Mount Everest, that sort of thing. They're either that or they're people who found God. They lost their sight and they got religious. And I am an unathletic pagan. I don't know. I neither of those. I wasn't either of those. So I
Yeah.
thought this is just an average person that lost their sight and is working through this. So that was the beginning of Long Time No See.
Awesome. Well, I understand that around the time, after you had lost your job, you were trying to make ends meet, and you even worked as a nude model for art
Yes.
students.
Yes.
And when you did that, obviously you have to sit perfectly still for periods of time. That gives you a chance to think.
Yes.
And so I understand that with you, you started crafting stories in your head, when you had all that time sitting there posing for students.
Yes.
And that kind of is when you decided, okay, I'm crafting these stories in my head. I might as well put them down and start writing.
Right.
And your first piece was an essay in 1999 about employment for people with disabilities, and you actually got published.
Yes. And
Tell me about that.
That was great fun. I mean, it was really fun writing that piece. The nude modeling job, yeah, I had applied for other jobs and wasn't getting work. And so every Sunday, my husband would read the classified ads out loud to me. And then my tape recorder, I would tape record. And then the next day I would, like real estate office needs a secretary. Okay, I'd take that number. And then the next day I'd call. And so he said, oh, here's one, here's one. And he read, University Art Department looking for nude models, call, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't tape record it because I didn't want him to know that I thought, well, I'd do that. And so I just memorized the phone number and called. And over the phone, sometimes over the phone, I would admit I'm blind. Sometimes I didn't. It depended on the job. But that one, I told her I was blind. And she said, well, you don't need to be able to see to, how did she say it? To take your clothes off or something. You don't need to be able to see to be a nude model. And so I took the job. And I kind of liked it. I mean, I was never comfortable taking my clothes off, but whatever. You get used to it. I couldn't see the people staring at me. That was helpful. And I got to learn a little bit about art by the professor walking around and talking to the students and telling them, look at the angle in her, and I would go to art. I was invited to go to the openings, and I would go, and they have wine and cheese. I loved it. I mean, it was fun to be part of it. And it was fun to write the story because it was funny. I mean, it was a funny story that I was doing this, but I also was able to get a couple paragraphs about the unfairness of and why, jobs and that kind of thing. And it got me on the Oprah show, but not really. I was on, I did it after, I went to an Oprah show. A friend of mine was on Oprah years ago, and they had an after the show little part. And so after the show, you could stand up and ask a question. And my friend plugged me with questions. She was she's a physical health. She was into exercise for women. So I told them a little bit of a fib saying, I told them I lost my sight, I lost my job. And then I started reading this book, Strong Women Stay Young was my friend's book. And I started exercising, and now I have a job, and guess what I'm doing? And then I told them, and everybody laughed and stuff. So it made the best of Oprah's after the show program or something like that. So,
interesting.
yes. So there I was.
I got to look that up. That's interesting.
Okay. Yes.
So you became a freelance writer,
Yes.
and you've written for various publications now. And then you just mentioned it in 2003, you published your memoir, Long Time No See. Had you thought about, you mentioned, you had a journalism background and writing was something you always kind of thought about. Had you thought about actually writing a book prior to this whole thing happening, or
No.
it just kind of made sense because you had all these recordings?
It made sense because I had all the recordings and I didn't have anything else to do because I couldn't find work. So I had the time
Right.
to work on it. I was about 27, 28 by then. And I kept up with most of my friends. I did lose some friends over this, but not, it wasn't, I, it's because this is something that didn't happen to anybody they knew yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as we get older, we're used to the, you know, if somebody has a major ailment or something, but I was the first of, and some people just didn't know what to say to me or
Mm-hmm.
didn't, you know, so, but the friends that stuck with me, were helpful. And I think I was going to say something else here about, the book. So we'd go to parties. That was it. We would go to parties, and my friends, they were people, what were they talking about? They were accountants, doctors, lawyers. These are all my college educated friends. And I wanted to be able to be part of the conversation. So I would say, once I'd actually started writing it, I could go to parties and say, I'm working on a book.
Right.
And, ooh, and I was doing something, you know, and if you say that, and I tell my students now, my writing students, the people I teach now, say it, because then you have to hold up to it. You have to keep working on your book.
Well, there's another thing about you that I really like, and that is the fact that you have evolved with the times, and you've done it despite, you know, your vision impairment. My mom is 82, and I just taught her how to use Facebook.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, and so I love the fact that you've evolved with the times. In 2006, you participated in a project with Easter Seals to determine if blind people can manage and update web pages, and
Yes.
you parlayed that into becoming an interactive community coordinator for Easter Seals, and now you work on their blog.
Yeah, I
Which
moderate their blog. Yeah.
and I think that's all awesome that you're doing all that. Explain to me what led you down that avenue. What made you decide I want to, you know, check out this whole web thing and you know, learn how to manage a website and all that.
What maybe the supervisor, the woman that became my supervisor at Easter Seals, was driving home in a taxi, and she heard, at the time I was doing essays for WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio, and I was recording them. And she heard me in one of the essays, and by chance she had just gotten a grant for Easter Seals to work with the federal government to have this intern program throughout the country for people who are blind, to come in and learn this program and see if they could do web content. So she called me and asked me, would I be willing to come in for an interview for this? And she said, it's about web content management. I said, oh yeah, that. And I didn't know what web content management was, but I said, yeah, I'd come in, because I thought, again, this is the good thing for me about having trouble getting jobs, or it forced me to try everything.
Yep.
Like try nude modeling, try web content management. So two things, but I did go in for the interview. I found out what web content management was before I went in. At the time I was 40, and I thought, they think I'm younger than I am. Interns are 23 years old. So when I showed up, I thought they wouldn't hire me, but they did. I mean, it didn't matter about age, but really it was the blindness issue. So it was a paid internship. By chance, when the year was over, they were starting a blog. And so they asked me to stay and moderate the blog. So that's how that all started. It was their idea, but it was my willingness to give it a try.
That's great. I
Yeah.
love that you did that. And what's also cool is, so you went into that, you didn't know anything about the internet really. You had never done any kind of web content stuff. From there, I understand ever since now, you've even been a presenter at assistive technology conferences. Like now you're a techie now.
No, but I do. Actually, that's my story. Is I wasn't a techie, and people that aren't. Your mother just learned how to get on Facebook.
Yeah.
People can learn, and so I
Right.
think that's usually my presentation, or that's why they have me there, or I'm on a board. They ask questions like you're asking me, just to see, how does this work and what can we try, and
Right. Well,
Yeah.
you mentioned this already, but in 2007, you wrote your second book, and this time it was a children's book about your seeing eye dog. What
Yeah.
inspired you to kind of pivot a little bit in terms of your style of writing and go with a children's book this time?
Well, Long Time No See took me 3 years to write, 10 years to revise.
Wow.
It took that long for it to become a book. And once a book is about 2 years old, you start, you're not invited to as many conferences. You're not, it's time to get started on another book if you want to keep on. And I loved going to conferences. I loved giving presentations. I liked staying in hotels if somebody else was footing the bill. And so I just really enjoyed it. So I had to get another book out, and I didn't want to write another, I didn't want to spend all that time. I didn't want to write another memoir. So I don't know. I'll be honest with you. At the time, people, what was the year? 2005. Things were going well with the economy, and people were really doting on their children. And I'd hear them doting on their children. I swim laps for exercise, and I have it a pass at a local hotel. And one time when I was done, I was, I knew all the desk people, and I was getting my towel away or something. And they said, "Oh, we had somebody complain that you were in a lane and their children should have the whole pool."
What? Really?
So I thought, okay, how can I exploit my writing and make money from these families that are doting on their children? I thought, okay, I'm going to write a children's book. And I don't know how I came up with the idea. Oh, I didn't want to write about myself. I was tired of myself, because when you write a memoir, you are answering questions about yourself. You're talking about yourself all the time, and it gets boring. So I thought, well, I'm going to write it in the viewpoint of the dog. So the dog is telling her story about what it's like to be a seeing eye dog, how sometimes it's no fun, but I know that I'm helping somebody, and that kind of thing. And it was great. It was a lot of fun to have a children's book. Well, I like children. So then I started going to a lot of schools with the book and talking to kids. So now I lead memoir writing classes for older adults. So it's a lot of fun to be with that population one day. And then the next day, my children's book is old, but that doesn't matter. It still sells, or it's still, yeah. Yep. So I can go to a school one day and then to an assisted living center the next. It's really a nice variety.
Yeah, variety. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, after your first book was published, and you just mentioned this, you did a speaking engagement at a Barnes & Noble in Chicago, and someone attended that event who offered you a different kind of opportunity, which you've just mentioned. This is a very interesting thing, teaching memoir writing classes to senior citizens. What did you think when, they reached out to you with this idea? Yeah. And tell me about how it's gone since.
Great. I'd be happy to. Yeah, that was the commissioner of Chicago's Department on Aging, excuse me, who was in the audience. And she called me. Oh, she called me and wanted me to meet her for lunch, which was, I don't know. She told me that she was at that event. So I met her for lunch. And over lunch, she asked me if I would like to lead a memoir class for adults. And one of my sisters is a teacher. I've always really respected teachers, and I've never taught a class. So I said that, I told her that, and I said, I don't think so. I've never done that. And she shoved over a big envelope, and she said, take a look at this when you get home. So I got home, and my husband read through it, and he said, she filled it all out for you. You just have to sign it, And I thought, again, this is nice to talk to you, because I don't think I've thought about this. I think my willingness to try something has really gotten me through, I'll try it. What's there to lose? So I signed up. That was 2000, I'm guessing 4, maybe. Now, all these years later, 16 years later, I was leading 5 classes a week before the pandemic. Of course, these are older adults too. They don't want to come out. They don't, so we transferred to Zoom, and I'm leading 3 of them on Zoom. I mean, I wanted to cut back a little myself. So I'm leading 3 classes a week on Zoom. They are great fun. Anybody can get a 500-word essay. Maybe it's not good, but they can get it out in a week. They bring their essays to class. Everybody gets a chance to read their work out loud. Depending on the class, every class. When people get older, they are starting to lose certain abilities. They are their friends are moving away to be with their family or going to the great beyond. Some of them are quite lonely, and a lot of older people are not listened to by others. So every week they know they're going to be telling their story to a group of people that are listening and are interested, and it really does fight the loneliness, and it brings people together in ways they would not know each other otherwise. When they start telling even the simplest story, like going to the movies, and talking about going to movies when they were younger, and then somebody else. I have one class that in the first class that I taught, I'm still teaching that in downtown Chicago, and it's free. It's sponsored by the city of Chicago, and so people come from all over the city for that, and they're immigrants, blacks, whites, Hispanic, all and so they'll do a thing about going to the movies, and then they start talking about, well, did you like jujubes? Yeah, I like jujubes. And then I don't know. There's a little time to talk after each essay, and they connect on similar things that happened to them, even though they were brought up in very different neighborhoods and
You know what I
locations.
love about you doing that? So in 2018, my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and I decided to produce a documentary about the lives of my parents.
Oh,
And I did it for a couple of reasons. One reason was because I wanted to keep safe for my kids, but another reason was because my dad was 80 years old and he had a story to tell. He was a European immigrant. He was a child during World War II,
wow.
and moved to Canada and not speaking a word of English. Like, he had a story I wanted to tell.
Yes.
And that's why I love that you're doing this, because these
Hmm.
people, they've lived a full life
Yes.
and they have a story to tell,
Yes. It's,
you
and
know?
I just love it. It's really a privilege to be in the room listening to all those stories. And you're right. We have a lot to learn from those people
For
if we
sure.
listen.
Yeah. I want to ask you about this. So you did an interview with the Chicago Tribune, and you talked about how you can relate to your students. And this is a quote from you. You said, "I think I can relate to this feeling of knowing you're capable, but other people don't see you that way. People look at you sometimes and assume you're not capable." Can you expand
Yes.
on that a little bit? Obviously, you're talking about
Sure.
your experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about my if people see me, well, I used a white cane for 5 or 6 years, and then I got a seeing eye dog, and things have changed since I got a seeing eye dog. I don't think it's fair, but let me just say, when I had a white cane, people avoided me. They were being kept, but they're trying to get out of my ways because
Hmm.
I'm whapping this thing. Um, People didn't engage me in conversation. It's kind of, you feel sorry for somebody using a white cane.
Hmm.
I did when I could see. I said, oh boy, I couldn't live if that kind of attitude. And I'm sorry that's the case, because a lot of people that use white canes are capable just like I am. But once I got a seeing eye dog, things changed a little bit. Whereas you see someone with a white cane and you feel sorry for them, you see somebody with a seeing eye dog and you think it's cool.
Hmm.
Wow, look at that. So that um, I've been asked by the seeing eye sometimes to write about what a seeing eye did for me, or what, the last question, what's the biggest change in dignity? It gave me dignity to have a dog, because people weren't feeling sorry for me. And even though I couldn't see, you can tell people are or kind of shunning away. Like I said, I lost some friends because they just
Hmm.
couldn't deal. Um, and I didn't really know this about older Americans or older people until I started leading the class, because they'd tell stories about being on the bus coming to class, and how nobody gave them a seat, or when they asked to have a seat, or I don't know, they just did not listened to or not
Hmm.
paid attention to, and feel like a burden.
Hmm.
Um, and if you have a disability or an illness, you can feel like a burden to the health system, if you let yourself go that way. So yeah, I think
Right.
that's,
The social media manager for Grappling with Grief, he has cerebral palsy.
mm,
And I interviewed him, and he
yes.
basically told me straight up, you see him in his wheelchair, and his verbal abilities aren't the greatest.
Hmm.
But in terms of cognitive ability, he's completely normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he told me, he said, people will talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So, yeah, I understand.
Yep.
Now, your experience led you, in terms of the memoir writing, that led you to a third book in 2017 called Writing Out Loud: What a Blind Teacher Learned from Leading a Memoir Class for Seniors.
Hmm.
What's the main thing that you think you learned from that experience?
To listen, I think. Um, I was listening anyway once I lost my sight, because that's what I've got. I like to eavesdrop. That's how I learn things. But to really listen and not judge until you've heard a story,
Hmm.
not try to just by just meeting somebody think you know them. I'll give myself credit that I went into the class when I first was going to teach the class. I thought, oh, this is going to be so, then they're all going to be sweet people, sweet old people. This is going to be so nice. And I did learn that whatever a person was like when they were 30, they are that exponentially when they're 80, whatever it was. If they were super sweet when they're 30, they're really dolls when they're 80. But if they were curmudgeons back then, they are more so I did, but I learned to understand that this comes from somewhere. I mean, when people are, sometimes they just they're needy, but there's a reason that they're that way. Just try to, I guess I just try to understand people from their stories. And even, you don't have to teach memoir to do that. Just when you're talking with people, ask them a question.
Now, people might be watching this and they might be wondering, okay, this lady's writing books when she's blind. Plus, you do the website work like we talked about, and you and I corresponded over email to set up this interview. So talk about the technological advances that have allowed you to do all that and basically live a normal life when it comes to all of that.
Yeah. The speech synthesizers for computers is what really flipped everything. And that was happening, let me think, when did I lose my sight? 1985. In the 1985, 1990, the speech synthesizers had started working. Then now, if you buy, I have an iPhone, it comes with voiceover. You don't even, it's not even something you have to add to it. It's a certain little app. So it's come that far. So it's just a regular function on these computers now. That I did the internship at Easter Seals was key because I did start, they were thinking about the blog then. Yes, they hired me and they hired another intern, and the other intern had a pretty big visual he could see a little bit, but he was a techie. And so when I started doing the blog, he was doing I would give it to him and he'd put it into the machine, but then they wanted him to do something else. And so he taught me HTML code.
Wow, you learned HTML
I know
too.
HTML.
Good for you.
I don't know everything in HTML, but that's how I do it because, when it says, they don't say this much anymore, but they were saying WYSIWYG all the time. What you see is what you get, when you're doing the, and so I would see nothing. So I got nothing. So I had to learn how to do everything by text and HTML. So I'm still using that. I envy all of you for being able to glance. I can't glance at my phone.
Trust me, that's actually a blessing in disguise.
Well,
people are glancing at their phone 24 hours a day, it seems.
It does. So like, if I were here and I said, oh, I got to check what time it is, I could just glance at my phone and then you'd know that I'm bored to death with my, or whatever. So I'm not able to do that. So if I guess it is a blessing.
Now, you're also the mother of a son with developmental and mental disabilities.
Yes.
Tell me about that, since I can imagine that's a challenge for anyone in any position, let alone somebody with a vision impairment. So tell me about that situation.
Yeah, well, after we were married, I became pregnant. It was not a planned pregnancy. And I was I was long told that probably should not have children, being diabetic and such. And so I was kind of hesitant. I mean, wasn't quite sure what to do when we found out I was pregnant, but we had a lot of tests done. I was in good health, saw doctors regularly. Pregnancy was going fine. And then when Gus was born, we found out that he had a very rare genetic condition called trisomy 12p. That's like Down syndrome, but much more serious than that. So that was about the worst thing I've ever gone through. That is, finding that out and looking into the future and what we thought this was going to be and what this is now. It was very difficult to take care of. It wasn't bad when he was slow to develop, and he didn't crawl. He didn't crawl until he was maybe 4 or 5 or something. So he was easy to take care of when he was a baby because he couldn't get anywhere. He was just in the house, but it did really slow me down. I think I wrote a lot during that period. That's when I wrote Long Time No See, when that was, because I was stuck at home. It was hard to get out. I would get volunteers to help me to take walks and things, and made some friends from the volunteers that helped, just because I couldn't push the buggy. I couldn't, we had a nice porch and a porch swing. I spent a lot of time there. When he started school, things got better. And that's when I started nude modeling, was when he started school, because that was a time when most of the nude models at the university were college students. And so they did not want to work in the middle of the day because they were going to class. But that was the time I had free, and they could schedule around Gus.
Well, you mentioned the pandemic, and that takes me to my next question. So we're doing this in October of 2020, and COVID-19 is still prevalent in the world right now. I understand that back in April of 2020, you experienced your own COVID crisis with your husband.
Yes.
Tell me about this. This was an interesting story.
Yes. And I don't know. I don't know if I was born under a bad sign or something. Well, I'll give you I'm giving the punch line away, but my husband was the first person, anybody in my family, any friends, anybody knew that was tested positive for COVID. He started feeling sick at home. Fevers. He had fevers, and they wouldn't go away. And he talked to the doctor, and the doctor said, just assume you have it and stay home and stay, isolated. I had no symptoms, but I also stayed home and stayed isolated. Although I had just come home with my seeing eye dog, a new seeing eye dog, a couple of months ago. My other one had retired, and I had to get out with her. But I just made sure I did it at times when we live in a 20-story building and 7th floor, so you have to take the elevator down. I just made sure I was at a time when other people weren't using it. I got plastic gloves. Anyway, did all that. He stayed at home, and then one night he got out of bed. He wanted to get a banana. He wanted a banana, so he got out of bed, and I went to get the banana. I came to bring it to him, and I heard this this crash. And so I called out to him and said, I thought maybe he held onto the bookshelf and it came down or something. He's having a hard time getting around because he was so feverish and losing weight and things like that. And he didn't answer. And then finally he did answer and said he was okay. But what had happened is he had passed out from these fevers. So that meant he had to go to the hospital. I mean, we called the doctor and they said, get him to the ER. Oh, parts I skipped. We couldn't at the time there weren't a lot of tests, so he couldn't get tested. He didn't qualify because he didn't have a cough or breathing problems. He just had the high fever. So he wasn't approved for a test. So he did get tested, but then he had to wait for 5 days. So it was during that time that he fell. So when he got to the hospital, they got those test results, and he was positive. He spent 10 days in the hospital and got better. But then my diabetic doctor said, I don't know if he can't come home because you could get it, and that would be awful, So I got tested. So when he got out of the hospital, though, I hadn't been tested. I didn't get the results back yet. So he had to stay at what we call the COVID hotel. The city of Chicago had set up all these hotels that if you had COVID and you had nowhere to go home to, you could stay in a hotel room. So he stayed, he tells the story better than I will, but he stayed in the hotel for 3 days, and then he had no symptoms in those 3 days, so he could come home. And then the day he came home, I got tested, and I had been positive.
You were positive too.
Yeah, but no symptoms.
Right.
So by that time, the public health department calls you to tell you that you tested positive. And then I said, well, do I have to be in for 14 days? She said, well, you have to be in for 14 days or you have to go 3 days with no symptoms. And then I reminded her I didn't have any symptoms. And she said, oh, you're fine. You can go out. Okay. So that was my doctor, when he said you have to get tested, he said, and it would be fantastic if you tested positive. And I thought, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. But he meant exactly what happened. That I was positive and I had no symptoms meant that my diabetic, history didn't end up in the hospital.
Right.
Or it didn't affect it.
Yeah. And so for that like 2 week period when your husband was in the hospital and when he had to go into the hotel, How did you how were you during that 2-week period? Like, were you
Yes.
able to get out and get groceries and, whatever you needed to do?
No, but but I have amazing friends. Mike got a ride, so I went down, saw him off at the cab, and thought this could be the last time I see him. And anybody that's brought friends or anybody to ER for COVID, you're not allowed to go past a certain spot. Um, so to get my head around that, I think I focused the first day on, okay, how am I going to do this? Or what do we have in the refrigerator? That kind of thing. But I'm in a book group, and my book group, they started this train, whatever we could, a meal train or something. Each person in the book group took a certain meal. And they would call a restaurant and say, I am picking up for Beth Finke, and I would tell them what I want from that restaurant. My friend would call, pay for the meal as a treat to me, and then deliver it to the doorman downstairs. So then I would come downstairs and get the delivery with my mask on and everything and bring it back up. So every night I got a different meal from a different friend delivering it like that. And it was enough to last through usually I would order big.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The days kind of flew by. There were every day at 2:00. The governor of Illinois and a doctor from Chicago would get on the radio and give a report about what was going on in COVID in the state and how many people had it and what's new. And so I'd listen to that, and I'd listen to certain shows on the radio. I think I was tired, and so I think I took naps. I don't know. It was Neverland in a way.
Yeah, it was. Well, I'm glad you were able to get through it.
Yeah, me too. Yes. And we're both healthy. Mike gets dizzy sometimes still from that. So he has to be careful when he's walking. Yeah, and this is 7 months later.
Yeah. Wow.
But we hear of people having worse,
Yeah, for sure.
worse long-term than that.
Yeah. Well, this next question, this is something that I tend to ask everybody that I talk to for grappling with grief. Every person that I interview seems to have found an outlet to help them overcome the adversity in their life and channel it into something positive. Several people I've talked to turned to writing just like you did. And for anybody that might be watching this or listening to this, maybe they're going through what you went through, or maybe they're going through another form of adversity and they're struggling with it and they don't know where to turn. What would you tell them based on your experience?
Boy, it's hard to come up with one thing to tell people. Don't let people tell you that you're doing something wrong with your grief. There's something you need to get over it, or they're not going through it with you. And everybody grieves differently. I, in a funny way, anticipating this interview, I thought through some things, and in an odd way, I sort of studied grief. I did it kind of internally, but I volunteered for hospice. And though they didn't want to give me a patient because they weren't sure I'd be able to handle a patient, they gave me the opportunity to do the grief and bereavement part. So I would go and talk to people after their loved one had died and just ask questions about what was Joe like? How is it, and do it for a long time, because their time is going to come when people stop asking you, and you might want to still talk about it. Find a friend who's a good listener. And is trustworthy. I guess my biggest, don't let anybody tell you that there's a proper way to grieve. There is not. And I did get a lot. I do recommend writing, but not everybody's a writer. So, but I was able to, writing Long Time No See was good therapy for me. And I read a lot of books about, a lot of fiction. I didn't realize I was doing this, but I was drawn to fiction that was about somebody dying.
Really?
This is a little girl. My father died when I was 3, and my family didn't talk about it. And I learned not to talk about it. Every time I asked, I didn't know, I don't really remember him. But when I'd ask a question, they'd start crying. So you learn not to ask a question. And so I think, without my knowing it, I was drawn to books, Little Women, Beth dies, it just, there's and maybe I learned from that too. I don't know if I'd recommend that now. When Mike was sick and in the hospital, all I was reading was these just silly mysteries where nobody dies and everything works out at the end. I was so reading and writing, I guess I would suggest.
When I look at what you've accomplished, so you're an author, a teacher, you got a university degree, you've done speaking engagements all over North America. I read something very interesting about you, something I didn't expect to read about you. Is it true that you are the only blind woman in America to be honored for sports broadcasting?
Yes, I am sitting tall.
That is fascinating to me.
Well, it's funny how that. Yes, that's true. Well, I say it all the time, and nobody says, "Oh no, I have this friend who's blind and won a reward for sports broadcasting." So,
Right.
So far, I think I'm. I was doing essays for WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio, in 2005 when the Chicago White Sox, they ended up winning the World Series that year. But my piece was about a group of kids who are blind that they go to camp that's camp, but it's in the city. They come to the city from all over Illinois, so from farm towns and all that, and learn together stuff about going to a city. How do you cross roads and blah, 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 blah. And one thing they do every year is go to the White Sox park and get a tour of the park, and they get to go on the park itself. And Mike and I are White Sox fans, so I asked if I could go get in on that tour and kind of cover the tour. And so I did that, and and one of the producers came along and recorded it. I also got to go on the field, and I got to run from home plate to first base. Somebody at first base was just yelling, "Here, come here, come here, come here, come here." And you could just run to first base. And it was really fun, and the children were fabulous. Like, anyway, they asked really great questions. So that was on the air at Chicago Public Radio. The people I was working with, the guy that was the producer, I'll quote him. He said, "I throw like a girl." He said, "I don't know anything about sports. I throw." And then the woman who edited it said she throws out the sports part of her newspaper every day. I don't read the sports, So they don't have many stories about sports. So when it came time to nominate a story for best sports broadcasting in Chicago, they nominated me, because that's about the only sports story they had that year.
Okay.
But they beat the Chicago football beat writer that's on WBBM radio. It was and anybody from television. It beat all. Yeah. So
that's great.
Yes,
That's great.
Yes.
So you got an award for writing a piece related to the Chicago White Sox baseball team.
Yes.
That's cool.
It is cool.
Yes. Now, I think you have an inspiring story of living with a disability for almost 40 years now and not letting it keep you down. And so I appreciate you taking the time to share it with us. And so again, this has been Beth Finke, author of 3 books, including her memoir, Long Time No See. It's available on Amazon.com and I guess wherever books are sold. So thanks very much, Beth, for this time. I love your story, and I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, thank you, and good luck with Grappling with Grief. I hope it goes along. I hope a lot of people get to read these stories.
Me too. I hope so.